Our first session is, again, a very, very interesting, dynamic, and forward-looking session, I guess we could put it that way, where we really look at the regional perspective and how we look at the energy trilemma and rebalancing the energy trilemma and just attempting to make sure there's balance in Asia and in the Pacific. So, of course, a very, very wide area there, but most important, as so many people in the world, producers and consumers, looking at this area where we're going to see lots of growth in the years to come. So, of course, I'm very, very happy to be joined now by the Secretary of the World Energy Council from Hong Kong. And also, of course, she is the Director of CLP Research Institute. So I'm going to hand over now to Jeannie Ng.
Thank you everyone for joining our session today. My name is Tina Scheer. I'm the Executive Director of the Business New Zealand Energy Council, which is the member committee of the World Energy Council. We are very much delighted to host that session today about the balancing of the energy trilemma in the Asia-Pacific region. The Asia-Pacific region is increasingly engaged in conversations around climate change and the energy transition. And key stakeholders need to come together and to see how they can balance the energy trilemma across the three dimensions, which is energy security, energy equity, and energy sustainability. In fact, cooperation is actually critical to balance the energy trilemma in the region. However, the vast and diverse region faces a complex set of challenges, such as geopolitical tensions, sub-regional integration issues, or the challenges of sustaining domestic economy development while you still decrease your carbon emission footprint. Now, on top of all of this, we're facing a health crisis worldwide, the COVID-19 crisis. Today, we'll be hear from our panelists on how policymakers and businesses navigating new threats, opportunities, while still balancing the pressure to keep security and sustainability high, but the costs low. So now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our sessions facilitator, Jenny Mee, the Director of the CLP Research Institute and Secretary of the Hong Kong WEW Member Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And so it is my job to try to keep everyone on track today. And I will start by first introducing our three panelists. We have Mr. Andrew Casely, the Chief Executive of the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority in New Zealand. We have Mr. Nobuo Tanaka, who is a former Executive Director of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which everyone is quite familiar with. And we, of course, have, last but not least, Dr. Zai Yongping, who is the Chief of the Energy Sector Group under the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at ADB. And so without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mr. Casely to provide a few comments. Each of the panelists will be asked to provide some comments, and then we will move into a facilitated discussion afterwards. Andrew?
Thank you, Jenny. Kia ora, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And the first slide that I'd like to share with you is just the reinforcement of where New Zealand's ranking was in the 2019 World Energy Trilemma. New Zealand ranked 10th, and when compared to a number of those other countries, and if I took it on a GDP per head of population expressed in US dollars, I suspect that if you had a weighting for that, we would rank even higher. So that's very gratifying. But what we'd like to do, of course, is to strive to be even higher on our own merit, irrespective of any other sort of economic measures. So what I felt it would be useful to do for you all is just to share the context of where New Zealand is as a country as we see it, currently across the three energy trilemma parts of energy security, environmental sustainability, and energy equity. So the first slide that I'd like to just cover is related to energy security, and in particular to cover the main energy components of our supply around energy in New Zealand. And the first is our liquid fuels. And in respect to our energy security here, we have very limited in-country stocks and particularly rely upon our international arrangements, particularly with Singapore, for backup reserves of our liquid fuels that are so critical for our transport fleet in particular. In respect to electricity, which we're very fortunate in New Zealand with between, on an annual basis, probably an 80 to 85% renewables generation profile for that each year, and a heavy reliance on hydro. But unlike Norway, we have very limited storage. And in fact, it covers only 6 weeks at any one time. And therefore, we rely upon thermal backup in the form of both gas and coal reserves to meet the security supply side around our electricity supply. And I'll make further comment about that in a minute. In respect to our process heat, which is the heat required to process a lot of our primary production in particular, gas is particularly important. But gas security has become tighter in the last while as a consequence of the current New Zealand government's decision 2 years ago to not issue any further offshore oil and gas exploration permits in our maritime economic zone. And so that is starting to impact on some of the reserves and some of the issues that will arise from that. Coal, of course, is particularly good for security of supply because you can stockpile it easily. And biomass is becoming increasingly important, particularly as we go down the decarbonisation route, with biomass being seen as a very viable and affordable option for providing energy to the process heat sector. And the one thing that has emerged just very recently by our government is their commitment to look at dry year storage requirements. And one that has been looked at in particular now.
Thank you everyone for joining our session today. My name is Tina Scheer. I'm the Executive Director of the Business New Zealand Energy Council, which is the member committee of the World Energy Council. We are very much delighted to host that session today about the balancing of the energy trilemma in the Asia-Pacific region. The Asia-Pacific region is increasingly engaged in conversations around climate change and the energy transition. And key stakeholders need to come together and to see how they can balance the energy trilemma across the 3 dimensions, which is energy security, energy equity, and energy sustainability. In fact, cooperation is actually critical to
particular. In respect to electricity, which we're very fortunate in New Zealand with between, on an annual basis, probably an 80 to 85% renewables generation profile for that each year, and a heavy reliance on hydro. But unlike Norway, we have very limited storage. And in fact, it covers only 6 weeks at any one time. And therefore, we rely upon thermal backup in the form of both gas and coal reserves to meet the security supply side around our electricity supply. And I'll make further comment about that in a minute. In respect to our process heat, which is the heat required to process a lot of our primary production in particular, gas is particularly important. But gas security has become tighter in the last while as a consequence of the current New Zealand government's decision 2 years ago to not issue any further offshore oil and gas exploration permits in our maritime economic zone. And so that is starting to impact on some of the reserves and some of the issues that will arise from that. Coal, of course, is particularly good for security of supply because you can stockpile it easily. And biomass is becoming increasingly important, particularly as we go down the decarbonisation route, with biomass being seen as a very viable and affordable option for providing energy to the process heat sector. And the one thing that has emerged just very recently by our government is their commitment to look at dry year storage requirements. And one that has been looked at in particular now is a large-scale pumped hydro scheme in the South Island of New Zealand that would substantially augment the hydro storage that would act as a super battery, if I could describe it as that, for our energy security. As well as that, there is increasing focus on where grid-scale batteries could play in the energy supply side. The next one I'd like to talk about is the environmental sustainability, and there are several things here occurring in New Zealand. The first is that the government has an aspiration of moving to 100% renewable electricity generation by 2035. In fact, the major party in our current coalition government has come out with a recent manifesto of bringing that forward to 2030. There have been major changes to our emissions trading scheme, which is the pricing of carbon, which is currently sitting at 35 New Zealand dollars per tonne. And that has moved up quite substantially in the last year as that scheme has been modified and been made more robust in terms of what its objectives are. The other thing is that we are going to see, in all likelihood, greater stringency around air discharge permits, which will make it more difficult for non-renewable energy users to get air discharge consents and therefore push them more into that renewable space. In addition to that, there is a strong focus on decarbonising our industrial process heat sector, our transport fleet, which is particularly challenging, and other stationary energy sources. In respect to renewable generation, the impact of the emissions trading scheme will have a big impact on this because it's going to increasingly make renewable generation even more attractive than it already is, with a long-run marginal cost of new renewable generation now go ahead of anything other, and particularly in the space of wind, for which New Zealand has a particularly good resource, but also solar is coming increasingly into focus as well. The final comment is just around energy equity, and a couple of comments to make there is that transport fuels have come in focus of the government lately, and they are looking at a more stronger regulatory oversight for our vehicle fuel retailers about the transparency of pricing and particularly the margins that our retailers have enjoyed in more recent times. The other thing that is likely to occur in New Zealand is the introduction of fuel economy standards. New Zealand is still one of the few OECD countries that does not have a fuel economy standard. And I believe that in the very near term, we will see that. We need it to help decarbonise our transport fleet. And I believe that the government will be committed to introducing that. On the electricity front, we're seeing an increasing focus on energy hardship with particular attention to increased energy efficiency measures, a focus on households being on their right retail plans for their circumstances, and the removal of what is seen as draconian overdue payment penalties that have particularly impacted on the lower socioeconomic groups in New Zealand. The other thing that there is an increasing attention on is the optimisation of the grid and network investment through demand management. That's in its early stages, but equally will play an important part going forward. So New Zealand has strong ambitions around the energy trilemma. We are wanting to improve. The government and society more generally is increasingly focused on the decarbonisation journey we're on, and particularly in view of the fact that it is less than 10 years now before our first 2030 Paris commitments come to the fore. So thank you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casely. And now, if we can have Mr. Tanaka, who is based in Japan, to provide his comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll talk about Trilemma of COVID-19 issues in Asia and energy. Please go. One more click. IEA said in the last World Energy Outlook, the oil age is coming to end. One more click. Oil is much more important than energy, electricity before, but future, one more click. Electricity is getting much more important than oil because the cost of electricity by renewables is getting cheaper and cheaper. The oil age is over. This is what the message of IEA in last year. Another one. one more. And COVID-19 hits the world, energy world very dramatically. Demand disappear, especially in oil. The 30% of oil disappeared. So Black April happened by, it's Fatih Birol said, 30% of global demand simply disappeared. But renewables, wind and solar increased. So this is a kind of test run of future by the COVID-19. Please go ahead. Yes, this is a policy, a CO2 emission in the history. One more click. The Lehman shock certainly declined, but it rebounded. One more, please. And this time, CO2 emission reduced substantially. One more click. But what will be the future? Rebound may happen if the government doesn't take serious action. So IEA proposed sustainable recovery plan. One more shot. And yes, the renewable, the carbon dioxide may not rebound, and 2019 could be the peak of CO2 emission. One more click. My argument, when a CO2 emission peak happens, maybe the peak demand of oil may happen together. One more click. IEA says, yes, and COVID-19 may force the peak demand of oil happened last year, 2019, which is the really serious problem for Saudi Aramco or oil producing, gas producing country. One more. And surprisingly, BP announced recent energy outlook about a week ago. And it said, to my surprise, that peak demand of oil may come much.
Thank you everyone for joining our session today. My name is Tina Shia. I'm the Executive Director of the Business New Zealand Energy Council, which is the member committee of the World Energy Council. We are very much delighted to host that session today about the balancing of the
policy, CO2 emission in the history. One more click. The Lehman shock certainly declined, but it rebounded. One more, please. And this time, CO2 emission reduced substantially. One more click. But what will be the future? Rebound may happen if the government doesn't take serious action. So IEA proposed sustainable recovery plan. One more shot. And yes, the renewable, the carbon dioxide may not rebound, and 2019 could be the peak of CO2 emission. One more click. My argument, when a CO2 emission peak happens, maybe the peak demand of oil may happen together. One more click. IEA says, yes, and COVID-19 may force the peak demand of oil happened last year, 2019, which is the really serious problem for Saudi Aramco or oil producing, gas producing country. One more. And surprisingly, BP announced recent energy outlook about a week ago. And it said, to my surprise, that peak demand of oil may come much earlier than we think. And in their scenario, yes, the even business as usual case, the demand will not exceed 100 million barrels per day. It means, and if substantial reduction of the CO2 emission happens, 2019 would be the demand peak. And this demand-driven change is the very much importance for the future. Another click. Because the countries who are working on oil and gas, this graph shows the import dependency of oil and gas. The vertical axis is gas dependency and horizontal axis is oil dependency. Those countries export both gas and oil are green. Blue are both importers. So the countries that for the United States is moving toward green part to have a same fortune and fate with Middle East and Russia. That is the reason why President Trump bridged the difference of the opinions of oil production cut by Russia and Middle East. The OPEC Plus and the United States make the deal in March and April. That was not enough. But now what we have to think is China, India, Europe, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN countries gradually move that direction, should think of seriously of energy security by using more renewables and importing less oil and gas in the future. Next slide, please. It is happening that tech companies and Tesla is having much more market cap than Toyota or ExxonMobil or Saudi Aramco. So these companies, Tesla, Apple, are requesting only using renewable energy in the future. And one more slide. This is the renewable energy 100% companies. Apple is a typical one. The GAFA is the one. They want themselves use only renewables, but asking their supply chain companies to do the same. So wherever you are in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, India, or United States, Europe, those companies who want to sell to Apple must use renewable in the future. So this is a demand side driven transformation of energy sector. Go ahead, next one. This is a TCFD. This is the financial pressure of investment into the ESG related companies. So financial side pressure is also driving the companies moving away from fossil fuel. Next slide, please. One of the answer is hydrogen. IEA calls for 4 technologies, which could be very important. One is hydrogen. Another one is carbon sequestration and utility, battery, and the 4th one is small modular reactor, because small modular reactor can live with renewable energy by adjusting their utilization. So hydrogen is probably helping the very heavy industrial sector, heavy user of carbon sectors to decarbonize, and also help oil and gas producing country by selling the blue hydrogen, and of course help renewables by providing the storage of electricity and flattening this volatility. Another one. Next slide, please. Yes, this is a green ammonia consortium which Mr. Muraki is organizing, and they are thinking of importing blue or green hydrogen in the future, produced either by Saudi Arabia or United States or Australia. Saudi is very interested in green ammonia by building the ammonia plant nearby the new city Neom by the Mohammed bin Salman and exporting it. So they are not only blue hydrogen by CCUS, but green hydrogen is their way of survival. Next slide, please. One issue I want to raise about equity is gender issues. Climate change is not gender neutral, because by the climate change, African ladies should walk more distance to fetch water. But also at the same time, they can change the climate change policies of the country and the company by getting the leadership role. So when the women is strong and participating in the decision, the company or the country can be more green and friendly to the climate change. That is the statistics. Another slide, please. COVID-19 is same thing. COVID-19 is not gender neutral. The women may suffer more, but at the same time, those countries who have women leaders take care of COVID-19 much better than the others. Germany, Taiwan, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Norway. One more click. Governor of Tokyo won great victory in a gubernatorial race, but this is because of her very tough COVID-19 policy. Let's go next one. This is the final slide, but I'm the chairman of the ICEF, Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, and this focus on women also. Climate, we are aiming at net zero emission, but women may provide a very important leadership in the companies, in the government toward zero emission. And for Asia, the same thing. Energy sector is very much lagged behind of using more women in the leadership role, but we have to change of this issue in the society or in the company or in the government for the better solution in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanaka. It's great to bring up the topic of diversity because sometimes we do often forget to make sure that that's also woven into some of these decision-making, really significant changes that can happen when we consider increasing diversity. And so now I will move on to Dr. Dai, who is the Chief of Energy Sector Group at ADB. Dr. Dai, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jean. First of all, I would like to thank World Energy Council for inviting me in this session. Interesting session, I'm learning a lot from previous speakers, but I would like to share my views from a financial perspective and financial from in Asia. The Trilemma framework developed by WEW has been actually very useful for helping ADB, Asian Development Bank, in assessing the needs of its member countries in Asia and the Pacific, and given this need and to prioritize our support in the region. We note from the last year's actually latest World Energy Council's Energy Trilemma Index, 17 ADB developing member countries in there ranked from 51, that is Malaysia, to 117, that is Nepal. With the bottom, mostly in the bottom half of the index, we have China, 72, India, 109. So plenty of support will be needed to improve this situation and balance the energy trilemma in our member developing countries. We are pleased to see there are 3 Asian countries that are member countries have been featured in top 10 overall improvers, that Cambodia, Myanmar, and China. So we're grateful to see this tool of Trilemma is being usefully used in our region and guide our work. Now let me turn to the questions for today's discussion from, as I said, from ADB's perspective as an international financing institution. As we all know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has caused severe and potentially long-lasting problems. Sorry, I just moved this. As we know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has caused severe and potentially long-lasting effects on health, livelihoods, and economies. The latest ADB Asia Economic Outlook has made a projection that the developing Asia's economy in general this year, 2020, will contract minus 0.7% actually. This is never seen in 6 decades for a region known as fastest growing in the world for many, many years. The growth rate, of course, varies significantly across Asia. South Asia will suffer the most with minus 6.8%, Central West Asia minus 2.1%, Southeast Asia minus 3.8%, and the Pacific Island will register minus 4.3%. Only East Asia will register a positive growth rate at 1.3%, with China leading at 1.8% in particular. So this is a very severe economic challenge for the region. And we already have big challenges in the energy sector, and that will remain in our region. There are many challenges in Asia, but let me mention 4 of them before I go to elaborate on the solutions. First of all, Asia has made great progress in providing electricity access. The electrification rate is 96% by latest statistic, and we are on track to achieve universal access for electricity in 2030 as required by SDG 7. However, if you look at this electricity access issue more carefully, there are many regions in Asia that are still experiencing intermittent, unstable power supply. There are about 1 billion people in Asia suffers from frequent electricity blackouts. So Asian countries need to continue to deepen the electrification process and providing electricity not only for household use, but also supporting productive uses in agriculture, for example. And other challenge, second challenge I will mention in the region is access to clean cooking and clean heating. I just mentioned that electricity access is almost done, 96% electrification, but clean cooking is just at the level of 50%. So 50% of Asian population, they are still using traditional solid cooking fuels, and that is polluting indoor, but also a source of outdoor pollution locally. So we are not, developing Asia is not on track to achieve 100% clean cooking by 2030. We have to see what kind of solutions to solve this problem. Actually, clean cooking is a very typical trilemma issue in a very specific context. Third challenge, I will mention that Asian countries, if you look at the primary energy mix, is still very heavily dominated by fossil fuels. Oil included is about 80%, oil, gas, coal. Coal in particular, for electricity, more than 60%. So this is a big issue with coal. Asia has to cope with the very big fleet of existing coal plants. Even we don't do new coal power plants, there's still a lot of existing assets that would remain polluting, and the emissions for GHG emissions. Currently, we are about half of the world GHG emissions, Asia, but this share may continue to grow if we don't fix our problem of fossil fuels in the region. Now, the last challenge I would mention is that energy efficiency is still a big problem. If you go to any commercial malls in big cities in Asia, the air conditioning is just freezing. And if you look at the equipment they use, the air conditioners are often old and poorly maintained. Efficiency is very low. At the same time, the houses of the household, they are often poorly insulated, and they use less efficient lighting and electrical appliances. The scope of energy efficiency is very high in commercial and household, but also in industry and other areas. Let's talk about also transport. The many cars are second-hand imported from other regions and with very low fuel efficiency. So efficiency remains a big challenge in Asia. So in view of these 4 challenges, ADB is conducting a long-term roadmap to see how Asia will improve the situation and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement target. I would like to mention 4 solutions or 4 ways to support government and business in low carbon transition and renewable energy development. First of all, we need to develop innovative technologies and new business models. We need to invest in innovative technologies that are relevant for energy transition to clean and low carbon systems. Mr. Tanaka mentioned a few new technologies. I fully agree with him. I also mentioned smart grid, batteries technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage are examples of technologies that will be important for us, for Asia, but also globally. ADB will continue to support these technologies by providing financing, but also we start providing by piloting new technology before we're scaling up in developing member countries. Since last year, we have launched 4 innovation challenges in clean cooking. As I just mentioned, it's not easy technology to provide clean cooking that will satisfy the 3 trilemma. So clean cooking is one technology. We'll try to find a good technology. Microgrid, peer-to-peer trading using renewable energy battery storage. We're also looking at artificial intelligence for demand-side management. And very recently, last week, we announced that we're going to launch a new technology innovation challenge for clean energy, centralized air conditioning. When I say clean, it's not just low carbon, but also clean in terms of disease proofing, disease resilient, that would stop airborne transmission in public buildings because of centralized air conditioning. So this is about new technologies. But secondly, another thing we need to do in Asia is to improve the energy system resilience. We need to build energy system that's able to cope with external shocks, like the extreme weathers, but also the pandemic, like the COVID-19. During this COVID-19 pandemic, renewable energy has shown remarkable resilience, actually, to the pandemic in many markets. However, in developing countries, we have also seen many renewable energy projects that are being, construction of these renewable energy projects has been suspended or postponed because of the transport interruptions and travel restrictions. So consultants cannot come, equipment cannot be delivered. So we must see how do we, support development of a local manufacturing capacity in Asia and train local skills for renewable energy. This will help us to provide more jobs for developing countries as well. The third way of addressing these challenges is motivate the business, private sector. ADB lending is only about fraction of the developing countries' need. Every year, our lending is about $5 billion, but $5 billion in energy, is being used for 40 member countries. So we are meeting about 1% or less of the need of these countries in energy sector development. So it's very important to mobilize more investment from private sector, and to mobilize this investment, ADB can play a role of leveraging. We provide 5% and 95% from commercial sources. Of course, ADB will support also our government in creating policy and market conditions for attracting more private sector investments. When we talk about the market conditions, let me mention the fourth and the last thing I want to mention. To make the market work, we need to put a price on carbon. Currently, ADB's lending, when we evaluate a project, we use a shadow price of carbon about $37 per ton. If we use this carbon pricing, and actually there's no chance for us to provide financing for a carbon intensive project if a country asks ADB to finance a coal power plant, then we apply this shadow pricing, and we'll see that the coal is not viable economically. Of course, we would like to see actually this shadow pricing become a real price also. So ADB is supporting our member countries in developing carbon trading systems so that eventually the carbon price will provide a very strong signal to investors. So let me stop here and follow up with other issues that may be raised later. Thank you, Jean. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tai. So thank you all for your comments and the range of perspectives ranging from what's happening in New Zealand and in Asia, and particularly in the oil and gas sector, for example. I just wanted to kick off our discussion with the first question. I mean, basically, given the need to continue to balance the trilemma for a more sustainable energy system, there are emerging threats and opportunities that continue to happen, whether it's COVID or the aspiration towards net zero carbon before the end of the century. How do the panelists feel that the government and business sectors can move forward in managing and navigating these threats and opportunities? And in particularly, perhaps in addressing the need for a transition as opposed to, in some cases, a big, huge 180-degree change. So I wondered if any of the panelists would like to respond to that question. Maybe Andrew, in New Zealand, you have a great, you're probably already balancing the trilemma quite well since you are number 10, as you mentioned. But I'm sure that in your case, with all the extra renewable resources you have in New Zealand, there must be some opportunities there. Are there plans?
Sure. Look, I'm more than happy to pick that up, Jenny. I don't think any of us underestimate how challenging it is, and yet the urgency is becoming more critical just by the week. And I know that in 2020, COVID's overshadowed everything, and I absolutely get that. But there's still a very strong determination for us to continue on the journey and to increase the rate of change. But there's a couple of things that we notice about the rate of change and the transition required. The first is that there needs to be some sort of regulatory underpin for decisions. And if I take our transport fleet, for example, and I made mention of this in my presentation earlier, it's not sufficient to have suboptimal vehicles coming into our vehicle fleet. We import about 300,000 vehicles, both new and used, every year. In the context of Asian economies, that's tiny, but for us, that's a significant number. We have one of the highest vehicle ownership rates in the world. And they stay in our fleet for an average of 14 years. So the legacy that we got with those is extreme. So the first thing we think is very sensible is to make sure that what we're adding to our stock, whether it be vehicles or homes, buildings, industrial energy systems or whatever, to get the right things happening as investment occurs now, and to make sure that the right policy frameworks are in place for that. In respect to the legacy assets that we've got, whether they be vehicles, energy systems in industry, electricity generation systems or whatever, that is complicated by, of course, the amount of investment that sits on balance sheets around that, whether in the home or in businesses or owned by the state. And the key thing in our view is to have what we've called and identified as transition pathways, so that there can be a strong focus by boards or government or individuals to see how they can transition to lower carbon forms of energy at the natural recycle processes for asset replacements. The other one that I would say too is that the cost of the renewable energies themselves, the fuels in particular, there's quite a discrepancy and major gap at the moment. For example, coal is still considerably cheaper than electricity. And so it's one thing to fund the capital required, it's another one to fund and to meet the challenge of the ongoing operating cost. And that's where I agree with Mr. Zai that the energy efficiency part then comes to play, so that we know that we're only using as much energy in the first place that we absolutely need to. And then it makes it actually much easier to deal with that delta between the costs.
Great, thank you. Mr. Tanaka, any comments on the question of balancing the trilemma while navigating the energy transition? And I guess particularly with the oil and gas sector, you had mentioned the move, of course, towards hydrogen, but quite often this kind of movement is quite slow. And I wonder, how can governments and businesses actually speed up that pace of transformation? That you also outlined a bit in terms of the direction of where it's all going for the oil and gas industry, for example.
Yeah, I think certainly, to overcome this trilemma, the government has a role in industry or oil gas sector definitely has a role. And as Dr. Zai said, the issue is the legacy part of the installment or equipment or facilities, because Asia is a very big growing economy. The global community depends on its growth, while the use of coal for the power is certainly the big issue. And these plants are relatively young compared to Europe or United States or Japan. So to make these industrial sectors and some existing power sectors to decarbonize is really challenge. So one of the solutions, as I have said, is to the use of hydrogen, because if you mix hydrogen by ammonia or hydrogen itself, the coal power plants CO2 emission could be reduced substantially. Even it's much better to rather using the very high-tech coal power plant, IGCC, etc. The cost is very high, but by the simply mixing hydrogen into the mixed, let's say, burning of these power, it could be very efficient way of reducing CO2 emission. Gradually, but these plants must move away from coal to gas and gas to the hydrogen. So this kind of scenario should clearly be understood, and the government should put in the policy toward that. The carbon pricing, carbon tax is one way, but inevitably this is happening because Europe is taking this very seriously as a national security issue, because rich renewables is not imported from outside, and they use it by connecting each other. So collective energy security of Europe depends on this renewable electricity, and hydrogen helps. So that's the reason why huge amount of money Europe has committed for the deployment of hydrogen infrastructure. This is the government money and the government policy, and it helps the existing industrial sector move toward decarbonization. Inevitably, if Europe is moving toward that, Europe will put the border tax of any products coming from Asia or United States to be produced in the level playing field in terms of the decarbonization. So if growing Asia needs the European market, we need to produce a very different way of using renewable energy or using hydrogen. So this kind of technological innovation, certainly government needs to put money and help and deployment, because technology is coming, but without government's strong commitment, this cannot happen. So the program of very much of the government policy is it can change by the different governments coming in. Democrat coming in, renewable climate change is important. When Republican comes, they negate it. So this on-off policy send a very terrible message to the private sector to invest. So stability or sustainability of the policy is very important element that the government should take into consideration and commit. Otherwise, who will invest the huge energy infrastructure for 30, 40 years? This is the very difficult part of the equation.
So, you know, in extension, I'd like to extend this question also to Dr. Dai and Mr. Casely, of course, as well, because I wonder if, you know, of course, the barriers that Mr. Tanaka had mentioned, everybody always talks about these policy barriers, but it seems, you know, could it be that in different markets and in different countries, the actual details, the devil is in the details in terms of the specific barriers? You know, some may be existing policies which are outdated or lack of policy. So I wondered, maybe we'll go to Dr. Chai first, and then I'll circle back to Mr. Casely on, you know, further comments on this. How do we speed up? You know, what are the barriers? You know, what are potential ways forward on this?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think there's no lack of goodwill at this stage today from government that they are very keen to push for you know, low carbon development, and that would be very, you know, good for their economy, for their people, and that's very clear. The question is what kind of policy would be right in the specific context you just mentioned. And as ADB, as a financier, when we come to a region, the first thing we do is to do a sector study and to see what would be the things that are needed to be put in place, policies, so that the private sector would come. I fully agree with Tanaka-san that the policy stability is key for investment decision-making process and the key for investors. In the past, for the last 10 years, for example, for solar PV, for example, we've seen that feed-in tariff have played a very important role for making this technology, you know, accepted in the market. It's now being, you know, introduced in the market as a mature technology. This policy were very, very essential for the success of solar PV, and the same way we can talk about wind power as well. However, in these 2-3 years, we have what we have observed is that, considering that dramatic decline in the cost of solar PV, wind power, and renewable energy, governments have started, you know, making a new generation of policy that are different, using different instruments. No longer feed-in tariff, different kind of thing, maybe like auction, maybe like you know, renewable energy purchase obligation, different instruments. So that I think today, when we talk about you know, government vision, we should also talk about commercial entities. The business should also have their vision in the long-term transition. They should not believe, you know, rely on only on government subsidies to succeed in such a market, because the situation has changed. It's no longer like 10 years ago. Today, the situation is very different. So I think the business people, the investors, should learn to have a new learning curve to assess the risks in the market, risk of renewable energy in the real market, without relying on government subsidies. I think this is a challenge for investors. As a result, in the last two years, let's say, there's some significant decline in the level of investment in renewable energy. I think it's just because we are in this learning curve that both the government have to find a new generation of policy that are conducive to support renewable energy development, and at the same time, the investors should learn and to make their investment decision based on market conditions, market forces. And for that, I think the linkage would be suitable. I come back to my theme I mentioned earlier, that suitable carbon price would help to bridge the policy part and the investment decisions. And that's what I can offer this stage. Thank you.
Great. And so, well, I like to pick up on Dr. Dai's comment on, quite often we think about government's role and businesses' role and, what can be done even within their own sector. We know that it works best when the two sectors are aligned in terms of the actual goals. And so that would be great. But as Dr. Dai said, there probably is room for businesses to actually try to take action themselves. And so actually I wanted to go to Mr. Casely on this, because I know, Mr. Casely, you've had a part of your career in the private sector. And so, I wanted to hear what you might have on what you think the business sector could actually move without, sometimes some of these policy signals are slow to come. So what is it that that the business sector can do, in the vacuum, or, the fact that these rules are too slow to come? What can businesses do to fast track? And perhaps, also we'll start to bring in the topic of technology. What technologies do we see that can help the different countries in the Asia Pacific region in this transition? Mr. Casely.
Sure. Look, thank you, Jenny. Just before I go specifically into that response around the private sector, I would just like to reiterate what this current New Zealand government has done around setting the framework in which they're expecting this transition to occur. The first is that there is now a much more robust and will continue to evolve emissions trading scheme, which is pricing carbon. And that, as I mentioned before, there is now a more meaningful price attached to that. And I believe it will only go one way, and that is higher. So that will drive investment in the private sector along that route probably more and faster than anything will, particularly as they factor in the projected increase in the price of carbon. I think that is an absolute given in our economy now. The other thing as well, as I mentioned, the regulation, there is now established on a cross-party basis in New Zealand, the Net Zero Carbon Act, which says that by 2050, New Zealand will be at a net carbon status. And that's got 30 years to run now, and it's not a long time to go. We have an independent climate change commission model on the UK that is in place to establish budgets and then to point government in the direction of the carbon reduction initiatives required to meet those budgets. And again, that is a cross-party agreement around that piece of legislation, which is not quite unheard of, but is very unusual in our democracy for that to occur. So I just want to paint that framework because it's a very strong bookend that I would describe now for the private sector to operate within. The private sector in New Zealand, in our observation, is not just waiting for initiatives of that sort. And they're not waiting because there is an increasing consumer clamour in the markets they operate for, particularly our exported product, but equally some of at the domestic parts of the domestic market, to understand the carbon profile of the products being sold, particularly in our agricultural sector. And so whether it is our dairy sector or our meat sector or our horticultural or wherever, those questions are being asked, and our companies are going front foot with that. So they are beginning to now invest in low carbon options to meet that consumer demand and to create their brands and their profiles around that. So that is an extremely positive initiative from our perspective, never at the rate of change that we'd like, but nevertheless happening. The final thing is that we're seeing here as well much more sophisticated financing options coming to the fore. Is that long gone, or appears to be long gone, are simple financing methods. And even with our very low interest rate environment that we now operate with, as I mentioned earlier, the price of the fuel on an ongoing basis has become probably the bigger challenge of the lot. And we're seeing much more sophisticated structures around leases that include fuels and the fixed price arrangements that are being provided by fuel suppliers, particularly in the electricity market. And I think the increasing sophistication of that will play a very important part as we go forward.
Right, and I guess on the topic of technologies, you know, we had heard about hydrogen, renewable energy, cook stoves in Asia. That range of technologies, all of these technologies also require the appropriate policy. And I think, you know, Andrew, you've just laid out how, for example, in New Zealand, that kind of framework that the government provides should be providing the right signals so that these kinds of low carbon technologies can be developed.
Absolutely right. And, you know, part of what we do in our own small way as an organisation is help share the risk of some of that early deployment by companies. We're seeing now co-firing with coal and biomass. We're seeing the deployment of electrode boilers in some of our larger agricultural processing facilities. We're seeing the use of high temperature heat pumps, and we understand that Mitsubishi is in the process of developing technologies in the 160-degree temperature range, which we think will be absolutely groundbreaking moves around both the efficiency in terms of the amount of energy used and the temperature range in which they can operate. We're seeing it, of course, in battery electric vehicles. The major problem there, of course, is price. And in our view, something has to happen around battery technology to allow that to become a much more affordable option for more everyday transport users.
Great, thank you. So I see that we're on track now to invite comments from our Vice Chair of the WEC Asia Pacific region, Mr. Sam Maraki. Sam, over to you. Any sort of the feedback from the session we've had so far?
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. And we had stimulative discussions with three distinguished speakers and excellent moderator. And biggest challenge in Asia Pacific is the carbon neutrality. And another challenge is the resilience and reliability of the energy system. Particularly in Asia Pacific, the dependency of oil and gas and still coal are very high and demand is increasing. So this is the biggest challenge, how to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in Asia. Even the leading company in New Zealand, they are still making challenge to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, such as from the transportation sector. This time, the drastic changes of the energy supply and demand are happening. Particularly, as Mr. Tanaka mentioned, that this change is driven by the demand changes. So this is a demand-driven changes are happening. And this is well incorporated with our new vision of the humanizing energy to look at the market and users and demand. And we had some discussions on the new technologies, on hydrogen, the smart grid, and energy storage. Those are the important challenges to cope with the carbon neutrality and also resilience and reliability of the energy systems. And the government role is becoming more important under this challenging time, and the policy stability is required for the industries and the financiers to make a continuous challenge for the energy transitions. Finally, that under the serious changes driven by the COVID-19, this could be the opportunity for us to accelerate our challenges for energy transition and the create more balanced energy trilemma, particularly the carbon neutrality and resilience and reliability. Today's sessions, I believe that gives a good input for the WEC fellow members and Energy Plus industries in Asia Pacific, how to challenge for the grand energy transitions under the new situation caused by COVID-19. Thank you very much for speakers and chair and moderator for your excellent contributions. And thank you for everyone for your participation. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Tina.
Yeah, I just want to really confirm that we've heard actually today that hydrogen could be sort of used as a clue to line it all up, which was really the very circle of hydrogen, and was kind of like overlooked because it was talked about this transport solution. And now it becomes that sort of system clue, I would almost say. And I really want to thank all the speakers today. It was a really interesting debate. And thank you for making the time. It's in the middle of the night for some of you, or early in the morning. So it's great to have you coming all together. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, the listener, basically. And great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
And welcome back. And what an in-depth and very, very engaging and interesting look at what's going on in Asia Pacific. So big thanks to Jeannie Ng. They're from CLP, the director for CLP of the Research Institute. And some fascinating discussion I found around there, as I'm sure you did there, Andrew Casserly, really looking at the ambitions that New Zealand has in the energy sector. And again, coming back to, what to do with the trilemma, the society and the government really looking at the decarbonization journey and already on it, but where to go, particularly towards 2030 to the Paris commitments. One of the interesting things he also brought up there is that we're seeing a lot more creative financing, particularly at the auctions that will come to the fore. So that's good in one way, but the simple financing option are there too as well, as he said. Nobuo Tanaka, always fascinating to listen to what he said. Of course, the former Director General of the International Energy Agency, and focusing now in Japan and what's going on, and also talking a lot about what's happening in the coal market, how that transition is happening, but so slowly there. And I think sometimes while we all talk about the energy transition, we really need to look at how coal is still a very popular fuel of choice, and particularly in Asia. And him, I think, putting out a call to action there whereby coal really needs to be moving over to gas and then eventually to hydrogen. But again, it has to have that huge commitment coming from the governments. Ultimately, the policy has to be there. And, it's a slow process. This transition is not a fast one, but it is in progress. And I think that's what we have to look at. And also from the Chief of Energy Sector Group of ADP, Zhai Zhongping there, talking about the situation and intermittency in Asia, the unstable power supply, and this is something that, when it is addressed and corrected and when it changes, will ultimately change people's lives. And again, very much reflecting, I think, what Angela Wilkinson from the World Energy Council was talking about yesterday too. This is very much about humanizing energy and looking at how it impacts people's lives. So also looking at clean cooking, essential, but how slow that's happening. So I think we heard a lot about that there's still so much to be done. And ultimately what he was calling for there was behavioral change in respect to energy consumption as well. That needs to happen. So a lot to happen, a lot of new technologies needed, a lot to address, a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities right in as we progress, so to speak, on the energy transition.